Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all of you. I wish I shared Senator Romney's optimism about the chances of not defaulting this year. Having been very involved in the 2011 debate, I am much more worried that this time we will go over that cliff. Ms. Hopper, great to see you. Thank you for your work in Maryland. I'm going to start by questioning Mr. Zandi. I think many of us are grateful, Mr. Zandi, for sharing over many years your expertise on fiscal issues. If I could just ask you regarding inflation today. We know we still have work to do in the economy, but inflation has now fallen 40% compared to the peak of last year. It's at a two-year low. Chairman Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, was recently asked about what he thought the pressures on inflation were at the current time, and he indicated that in his view, it's not fiscal policy that's driving inflation now. Do you agree?
Agreed. I think the inflation we're suffering through right now is the continued fallout from the impact of the pandemic on supply chains, labor markets, and the Russian war in Ukraine and its impact on energy, food, and other commodity markets. And what's happened is those two shocks conflated and infected inflation expectations and wage and other dynamics in the labor market. So lots of reasons for the high inflation. At the very tippity top is the fact that we're still working through the fallout from those two massive shocks to the supply side of the economy. At this point, I don't think fiscal policy has played any role at all. Just one quick other point. If you had asked me that question back in 2021, I would have said fiscal policy, yes, is playing a role. But at that point, hard to remember back, that was deemed to be good inflation. We had been through a decade of suboptimal inflation. We wanted to see higher inflation. It wasn't an issue.
Let me, I've just, my time's running short.
Sorry.
I have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So I did see your assessment that if you actually passed the House Republican plan, we would lose 790,000 jobs in the economy. Have you had a chance to look at the Biden budget proposal and determine whether it would cause anything in that range of job loss?
No, I mean, they both have deficit reduction long run. Oh, of course, the House legislation on the spending side, the president mostly on the tax side. But in the next, when the economy's, in the next year and a half, when the economy's incredibly vulnerable, the president's budget does not have the same kind of negative consequence. So in longer run, the negative consequence of the higher taxes in the president's budgets, all else being equal, weigh on economic growth, but to a very modest degree compared to the budget cuts that are in the House legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Zandi. Mr. Rydell, you mentioned in your testimony that we actually eliminated our deficits and saw a surplus back around the turn of the century. Mm-hmm. Do you recall what share revenues were as a percent of GDP when we did that?
Back then, revenues had jumped to 20%. Spending fell to about 17%. Essentially, the budget was balanced by a huge defense savings and a revenue bubble. Right. And then the bubble burst and 9/11 happened.
Right. So as you said, at that time, revenues were around 20%.
Correct.
And I think you're aware of the fact that if you look at the current budget and project it out a couple of years, we're talking about 18%. Now, 2% may not sound like a big gap, but when you're putting 2% on top of a huge economy, that's a lot of revenue that we had back in 2000 as a percent of GDP that we do not have today. Here's my question to you. President Biden has put a budget plan on the table. In fact, much more detailed than the plan that passed the House of Representatives. It has $3 trillion in deficit reduction. Do you think President Biden should take the position that he would veto a debt ceiling increase unless he gets his way on how we reduce the deficit by $3 trillion?
I think both sides need to negotiate.
No. That's President. I'm asking you a question because the House has said, mm-hmm. if you don't adopt this is our bill. Mm-hmm. If you don't adopt this, we're going to default.
Right.
I'm asking you, should President Biden take that position and say, if you don't reduce the deficit my way by $3 trillion, by raising taxes on very rich people, increasing taxes on corporations to actually lower than it was a number of years ago, and requiring that prescription drug companies contribute more so Medicare pays less, Should he say, if you don't adopt my plan, I'm not going to sign a debt ceiling increase?
I think the president should say, we need to adopt a deficit reduction plan. I've made an opening offer, but I'm flexible to negotiate.
And if we don't do that, we should default. He should say that.
I don't think anyone should say.
Well, that is what the House Republicans are saying. And so why you have number 3 point in your testimony, avoid a default at all costs, that is not what the House Republicans are saying. They're saying if you don't adopt our plan, we will default. That is reckless. You know it, others know it, and the president knows it, which is why he hasn't taken the position that it's either his way or the highway. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Martin.